right, well, welcome everyone. I'm Rachel Robinson. I am the interim dean of SIS and a longtime faculty member here. I am so excited to welcome you to a new series that we are developing, which highlights SIS alumni around the world who are making an impact through international service in many, many different ways. And so I just want to say, what do we mean by international service? It's in the name of the school. We talk about it all the time, and it's what makes us distinct. We apply it broadly at SIS, and we let people decide what it means to them. So there are multiple ways to be of service to humanity. And what I just told all of our admitted students on Saturday is that we will equally celebrate you if you go into the Peace Corps, if you go work for a consulting firm, or if you go into the intelligence community, among, broadly other things. So we have so many examples of what that service means, and to all of the alumni who call this place home. So one of the best things about serving as the dean is that I get to know our alumni and their career journeys. So last November, during a visit to my hometown of Seattle, which we just discovered that I think everybody in the room is from Seattle, not quite, but it was close. I got to meet with several alumni, including one with Commissioner Sam Cho, today's special guest speaker. So alumni like Sam have shown us again and again how much discovery takes place during their time at SIS and the preparation needed to move from SIS classes to internships, to work opportunities, to a thriving career. So as we'll hear from Sam today, he arrived at SIS as a transfer student with a specific idea of what he wanted to do with an international relations degree. And we know this from all of our students. It's what draws them to us. But he then found a whole new path, and that often happens as well. So his journey led him to organizing FOIA requests in the basement of the State Department, to working in the Obama administration, to turning his own import business, to being the youngest and the first person of color elected to the commissioner of the Port of Seattle. So, Sam, I'm delighted to see you again. I'm so glad you're here, and to welcome you back to campus. To all our alumni, you are welcome anytime. We are always happy to see you. Sam is going to be in conversation with Professor Bob Koopman here, who is the former chief economist at the World Trade Organization, and author of the Global Supply Chain Value Report. And so like Sam, he is also a global trade expert, but with a different path. And I'll just say one of the examples that we also love to highlight of how faculty at SIS come from many different backgrounds themselves. So thank you both, and I look forward to the conversation.
Well, thanks, Dean Robinson. It's great to be here with Sam.
Likewise.
It's as somebody who works on international trade, to be able to talk with people who actually practice trade on a daily basis. It's truly fascinating, as opposed to somebody who's sitting there thinking about complicated models or ways to measure this stuff. So some of you may not realize, but Sam works for what is roughly the 5th largest port in the United States. And it's a combination. When I first started talking with Sam, I thought, well, it's the ocean port. But he actually does both the airport
That's right.
and the seaport. And in our conversation prior to this little discussion, he was telling me he spends about 60% of his time on the airport operations. Now, as somebody who does international trade, I tended to focus on the seaport because about 80% of global trade moves that way. But to have somebody here who's doing it on a daily basis and has to get elected, I think that's a really difficult bar to continue. As Rachel pointed out, you were the youngest chairman, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I was elected in 29, and I became the president at 32, I think.
President.
Yeah, president of the Port Commission. So I guess that makes me the youngest.
Well, it's great to have you here. So before I get to my questions, I'm going to put a little plug in for a course I'm developing in part of our Trade Today series that's going to be looking at measuring global supply chains and where you might find choke points, given what's going on in the global economy right now, we are pretty sensitized to these kinds of choke points, geographic or economic. Mine will focus on the economic. So, Sam, your family came to the U.S. through the Port of Seattle.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Well, now you're part of the government of that same port.
Yeah.
How has this shaped your view of the world and how you view your job?
Yeah, in many ways, I mean, it's a full circle. It was a full circle moment when I became the port commissioner. My mom immigrated to the U.S. in '89 through, and I have to clarify, when I say that they immigrated to the Port of Seattle, what I mean is that they flew here into Seattle Tacoma International Airport. There was a point after I got elected where my mom came up to me and she says, "Why does everyone think I came in on a boat?" And I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And goes, "Everyone thinks that we immigrated on a boat into the Port of Seattle." I was like, "It's not what I tell people," but I think there's an assumption that when they say, "Oh, we came through the Port of Seattle," that they came on a boat. They flew in here. My dad came in '85. And it was a very different time, obviously, in the 80s. And so their experience immigrating through Seattle Tacoma International Airport and hitting U.S. soil for the first time has really informed the way that I govern and the way that I change things or do things at the port. In fact, about 2 years ago, my mom and I did a walkthrough of the airport behind the scenes. And our staff kind of did like I think it was our 100th year anniversary or 75th year, 100th. It was one of our anniversaries. And so they wanted to do a video that highlighted, aspects of the port. And I said, well, why don't we bring my mom in and she can talk about what her experience was immigrating through our airport. And so it was a really special moment for my mom and I. She would walk through the same places that she went through when she immigrated here. She'd say, oh, like when I walked through here, there were no signs in other languages. It was all English. My English was bad. I couldn't navigate, and she would point out, oh, now I see these signs in Korean and Japanese and Chinese, and the intercom speaks to me in Korean. And so she talked a lot about how things have changed and improved. And I think that helped me to, realize, a lot of that experience as immigrants, having immigrant parents has really informed the way that I, perceive policies, and so it's been tremendously influential to how I push policy and look at through things the lens of equity and whatnot.
I think that's fascinating. Simple little things like having multiple languages on the signs, right? And then the announcements can make you feel much more welcoming.
Yeah. One of the first things that I did when I got to the Port of Seattle, literally within the first 2 months, is, most airports today have these anti-human trafficking signs, they're awareness signs. And when I got there, all our signs were just in English. So it was like, if you're being trafficked, call this number, whatever. And my first reaction was, if you're being trafficked here through another country, how are you going to be able to read this unless you're fully literate in English? And so we actually had those signs translated into the 8 most commonly spoken languages in the region, Russian, Korean, Chinese, etc. And I don't know if I would have had that reaction if I had not, again, had known what my family's, experience was going through the airport. And so this is just one example of how, like, my lived experience or the lived experience of my parents have really informed the way that I see policy.
Yeah, so it's not just like government officials that influence how visitors to the U.S. feel.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
how the infrastructure is
That's
set
right,
up,
yeah.
right? Yeah. So when I looked into your career, I was pretty fascinated. You've done government,
Yeah.
Elected office, you've done startups, you had your own export company.
Yeah.
It seems like the world kept shifting around you the whole time. I wouldn't describe your career path as a ladder. I'd say it's more like a web. So what do you think helped you navigate
Yeah.
this complex, rapidly changing world and helped you adapt?
Yeah, I think some of the adaptation or adapting I had to make was forced upon me, right? And so I think up until my mid-20s, my career was pretty in line with what you would expect from a DC college grad, right? I went to grad school, I worked on the Hill, I worked in the Obama administration. And up until that point, it was pretty, par for the course for a lot of folks who want to kind of go through that I don't know what you want to call it, but that path. And then what happened, which is also kind of par for the course, is that you have a change in administration, or you have an unexpected political outcome that really, diverts you. And so for me, that was when obviously Donald Trump got elected the first time. I chose to stay in the Obama administration till the very end because there was an expectation amongst us that Clinton would win. And with Clinton's, presidency, there was an expectation that many of us would be retained into the next administration. So there was a huge chunk of us that left prior to the administration, probably around the September, August timeframe. And then there was those of us who stayed through November and obviously had to live through the transition. It was a very tough job market for me and all us Obama alumni. You got to remember the House, the Senate, the White House were all occupied by Republicans at the time, so there weren't a lot of jobs for the 2,000 plus Obama alums. And so a lot of us went home, right? And so, I think staying agile and open-minded has helped a lot because I always tell people when I started my business, right, coming out of the Obama administration, I was kind of at my lowest point. It was a point where I had nothing to lose. I was living off unemployment, and I just took a swing. And so sometimes those circumstances push you to make certain decisions maybe you wouldn't have if you had a secure job, and it would have been more of a risk to leave that job or whatever. I also think that if you look at my career, there's a bit of a flywheel effect or a halo effect in that I was able to leverage my experiences from the past to then snowball into what ultimately was a company that exported to Asia. When I was on the Hill, I was a foreign policy trade defense legislative assistant. So I worked on TPP and Trade Promotion Authority for the member of Congress, and he was on the Foreign Affairs Council. My dissertation in grad school was on free trade agreements. And so I kind of had that, base knowledge, the theoretical knowledge on trade. And so when I left the Obama administration and I caught on to this opportunity to export eggs to Korea, for those of you who don't know the story, I think that spark was because I had this baseline knowledge and awareness of what was going on in the world. And then I put two and two together and said, well, let's try it. And so I was very fortunate that business worked out very well for me. And then obviously that flywheel or that halo effect turned into, well, you do the exports, you've worked in policy, you should go run the port, right? And so a lot of people look at my career trajectory and say, well, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It almost looks kind of planned, right? But I think it was Steve Jobs who says you can only connect the dots in hindsight, right? And while it seems like I took each step, well, they may not have been obvious, but they were they complemented each other to get to where I am today. It was certainly not planned, right? And so I've been very fortunate, but I've also had to stay very open-minded. If you had told me in 2013 when I graduated from AU that I'd be running for office at 29, I would have told you you're crazy. And if you told me that I was going to run for a port commissioner, I'd tell you, what's that? Right? So.
I'm a professor here, and I teach students economics and the economics of national security, international trade. I teach them a bunch of technical stuff, right?
Yeah.
So what do you think students need to know beyond the technical knowledge that you learned here? How do you build this kind of resilience and adaptability?
So I think the single biggest advantage you have of being in DC and maybe going to school at AU is the fact that you're in DC, right? And I think, just thinking back to my time here at AU, and this is probably obvious to the folks in the room and, watching now, but most students who go to school outside of DC have to spend a summer here to get an internship or take a semester off to work in DC. I had the luxury of having internships basically every semester here at AU, right, even if it was part-time. So by the time I graduated, I had 3 or 4 internships, right, whereas I think a lot of grads out of college were trying to get into those internships. So that was a tremendous advantage. The fact that you have access to, all the halls of Congress and the government bureaucracies is a huge advantage. One of the skills that I learned in DC although some people don't like DC for this, is like the ability to network and you know, I came from Seattle. Seattle's kind of known for being more passive aggressive, not as, you know, forward in the way we express ourselves and whatnot. And you know, I wouldn't say that I came to DC with a very strong skill set around networking and, you know, and building that skill. But you know, in DC, when you're in DC, like you go to happy hour after work, and the first question you ask people is, where do you work, right? And you build up that that skill. And so, you know, beyond the technical side, it's really like the social skills, the professional skills that really helped me, because the beauty of what happened was I learned all that stuff in DC and I took it back to Seattle, and it was like 10x, right? And there were moments actually when, and this was a humbling experience for me, where people would tell me to chill out a little bit, right? And they'd be like, hey man, you were a little aggressive in that meeting. And I'd be like, what, really? I was just, you know, just telling you how I was thinking. And I'm like, no, like, you came off a little strong. And I still, there are moments where I feel like I'm totally being normal, and my colleagues are like, wow, you were really aggressive in that meeting. Or, you know, how do you work a room when you're in a function or a meeting? Like, those are skills that I learned out here working for a member of Congress or working for a principal that I observed and learned, and then I just took back, and it's paid tremendous dividends, because I only moved back to Seattle in 2018, or 2017, 2018, and then I ran for office less than 2 years later. And you know, I had not been back in Seattle since I graduated from high school in 2008. And so there was a huge gap there. And when I moved back to Seattle, it didn't feel like home to me. And I don't know how some folks here feel here, but Seattle has changed so much in the last 15 years. Some parts of it are unrecognizable. And so it almost felt like I was starting all over, even though it was the city I grew up in. And so I think some of those skill sets really did pay dividends when I went back to Seattle.
Well, last time I was in Seattle, there were sea turtles and tear gas in the streets.
WTO days, huh?
WTO meetings in 1999. At that time, I was with the U.S. government. But it sounds like, so recognizing you got to have technical skills, you got to have social skills, sounds pretty important in terms of being able to build resilience. So going a little deeper on this, when you get feedback, like you came across a little strong in that meeting, there was something I've heard in Washington a lot, and that is, you know, perception is the reality for many people. So what's your reaction when you get told something like that? Do you try to adapt, or do you just double down and like, well, this is me and this is the way it's going to be?
You know, I adapt in the sense that I try not to always be that, you know, strong or pointed.
Be strategic about
it? I'm a little more strategic about it. And the reason that matters is because if you're always the squeaky wheel, so I have some colleagues who, you know, you always have that one colleague who always expresses their opinion or has their own little monologue in a meeting or whatever. And, you know, I remember having a conversation with him, and, you know, the old saying, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. And I tell him, you know why the squeaky wheel gets the oil? It's because no one wants to hear the squeaky wheel, right? And so for me, like, I'm very selective with when I'm that aggressive. And the reason that makes sense is because if you're always aggressive, people will eventually become numb to it, be like, oh, there goes Sam, he's going off again, right? But if you're very selective and strategic, when you do go off, people are like, oh, he's serious.
That's signal, not noise.
Exactly. It's a signal. It's like, oh, like 80% of the time, Sam is pretty calm, cool, and collected, but he was super passionate about this. We better pay attention to it. So I think I don't take offense to people when they say you were really aggressive on that, but at the same time, I know that they know when I'm aggressive, I really care and I'm serious, right? So I don't adjust my tone or anything like that, but I am far more selective in the moments that I'm like that.
So you had this practical business experience, and now you help shape and develop policy around the port.
Yeah.
So your family came in, that has had some impact on how you see your role. But what about the practical business experience and how you see your role?
Yeah, that has been tremendously invaluable for me, and I think for the port, mainly because, as a port commissioner, you have some very clear duties, right? You pass the budget, you pass policies, and then you do some, surrogacy, like external relations stuff, right? So you're kind of like the face of the organization. One thing that I pride myself on as a port commissioner is actually the business development side of things. So you'll find me in Asia at least twice a year talking to carriers and businesses, trying to get them to bring their volume to our gateway as opposed to Vancouver, Canada, or even LA Long Beach. And I think that's really helpful because when you can talk to businesses about the benefits of shipping a container through the port of Seattle as opposed to, LA Long Beach, I tell them, look, our rail turnaround time is less than 3 days. Our dwell times are, less than 2 weeks. Those are metrics that you can compare to an LA Long Beach or Vancouver and say, your container's sitting on the dock for 3 weeks. Why are you paying for those, D&D charges? You can get the stuff through quicker through the Port of Seattle. And so having been an exporter myself and having had that experience of paying the demurrage charges and all that, and the dwell times and all that stuff really helps because you can speak the language of those folks who are really just trying to get their containers to where they need to go at the end of the day. And so the business development side has been extremely helpful because I understand, at the end of the day, it's all about cost, right? How much money can you save on D&D charges if you go through the Port of Seattle relative to Vancouver, LA, or Long Beach. And so that's been extremely helpful from my perspective. We've been able to get some business back to Seattle as a result of some of those conversations.
So there's some economic research that suggests that time is money, right? That
Absolutely.
for every day a good sits at the port, it's like an additional 1% tariff, right? So the longer it sits there, it adds up very quickly. It varies depending on whether the good is like a high-tech
Right.
good or some sort of basic commodity. You sit at this very interesting intersection, right? So there's federal policy,
Yeah.
there's state policy, there's city politics and city policy.
Yep.
And then you have these complex international commercial
Yeah.
relationships, right? So all of these things right now are like under stress,
Yeah.
right? Pretty much every dimension there
Yeah.
has some sort of stressor in it. So do you think that ports and cities are becoming more independent as a result of these stresses and making their own policies and trying to find their way forward?
Yeah, I can speak for the Port of Seattle. Our structure is very different from most port authorities. Like the professor mentioned, we are elected as commissioners, and we are our own special purpose government. Most port authorities in the United States, if not all the other ones, are under a municipality or a state government. And so in LA, the mayor of LA appoints the commissioners. Same thing in Long Beach. In New York, it's the governor of New York that appoints the harbor commissioners for the New York Port Authority. And so that independence is a little, it's under the bureaucracy of a city or a state government. For us at the Port of Seattle, we are completely independent of the state government, the city government, despite us having to work with them. We are not overseen by any of those other governing bodies. And so for us at the Port of Seattle, we've had the freedom to really step up in that conversation around subnational diplomacy and what our positions are relative to the federal government or even a state government, right? And I think in the last couple of years I've really tried to push us to be that independent voice that pushes the policy agenda on sustainability and other things on trade policy. And so for us, we've become far more opinionated and vocal, and sometimes it's worked against us, and sometimes it's worked in our favor, especially in today's political climate when we have an administration that doesn't care about climate change. And seems to be doing various tactics on federal funding, and these trade wars with various countries have direct effect on us as a port. We're having to step up and say, hey, Despite the policies or what this guy says in DC, we at the Port of Seattle are open for business. We're still committed to our sustainability goals. We're still doubling down on X, Y, and Z. And so I think some of the policymakers call this like new localism. In the absence of leadership or support on the federal level, then local governments need to step up. And I think you're seeing that, especially in the port side with us, but also there's some other local leaders around the country that have really stepped into the limelight to make sure people know like this is not the consensus in the United States.
Well, the interesting thing is if you get that kind of, those kinds of developments, there can be unexpected innovations that other people learn from, right?
Yeah, in fact, I would actually argue that most of the innovation, even on the policy side, starts local. I mean, there's a saying, all politics is local. And I think very rarely does maybe I shouldn't say very rarely, but I think most of the great ideas that you see even in Congress or anything like that, it's usually like incubated on a local level, right? And it's a proof of concept or a case study where something may have worked in a city or a state where, and then the idea is to take it national, right? And so if you had asked me 10 years ago when I was a DC guy, the swamp creature, I would have been like, no, all the best ideas come from DC. But now I'm a total convert that some of the best ideas come from the local government and they make it their way up to the national level.
And they can be, sort of adapted to the local conditions. So what may work in Seattle may not work.
Yeah,
in,
and that's very true as well.
Baltimore,
it's not a
something
one-size-fits-all.
like
Yeah.
Yeah. I am curious. So with the trade war now and all these different tariffs, and you have to have Customs and Border Protection on site, right?
Yes.
Are they slowing things down because they're having a hard time figuring out what tariffs to apply, or?
It has mucked it up a little bit. I mean, I think most of it has just been the shifting policies, right? It's like 15% one day, it's like 30% the next day, and so that has slowed things down. But trade volumes in general have slowed down, so you're not feeling it because if there's less volume, you have more time. Okay. And so it's been interesting to work with CBP to figure out what we're doing. It's going to be more interesting to see how these tariff refunds are going to be administered now that the Supreme Court has ruled that the IEEPA tariffs were, illegal. And so we're still working through that and saying, okay, how are we going to process like $175 billion in tariff refunds.
So would that fall to you?
No, I think what's going to happen, CBP is going to have to set up a submission.
But you'll have a lot of stakeholders who are very interested in this.
Yeah, I mean, people will reach out to us just by the nature of the fact that we're a port, asking how we get those. We have instances where, and this is a slight digression, where Donald Trump announced that the federal government would pay people to deport themselves. You guys remember this? Like $2,000 or something? Yeah. Which never happened, by the way. But people would come to the airport asking for their money. Yeah. I would get emails and people were like, hey, I'm about to deport myself. Where do I go pick up my $2,000? And I'd be like, the money, that's not a thing, right? And so, I mean, we are on the front lines of, even if it's a policy or something that we had nothing to do with, we often are the first ones to be able to get that reaction from constituents.
So you mentioned earlier that climate change is not a priority for this administration.
Yeah.
Right? And yet, when you look at your agenda, you've had a fair amount of focus on things like environmental sustainability, equity and inclusion, ending human trafficking, those kinds of things. So how do you operationalize this? Is it because you're this independent operation that allows you to be independent from the federal government and the state and local governments, or?
Well, that's a huge part of it. In fact, it's very interesting because if you go look at port authorities across the world, most port authorities report to the federal central government. Right. And so they're not usually allowed to have their own positions. They, every time they do something, they got to get approval from, the whatever department of that federal government they belong to. We're not like that. That has its pros and cons, but like I said, in the absence of federal, presidents, most international organizations still want to engage with the U.S. You know, the U.S. is just choosing not to send delegations. So I was in Brazil for COP30 back in November. Not a single federal, you know, person was there. But you know who was there? Gavin Newsom was there, right? And a whole California delegation. I was there representing the port in the state of Washington. And so when the federal government withdraws, there's like this huge vacuum that you can potentially fill. It really helps us catapult ourselves to, you know, and so like selfishly speaking, like Trump's kind of been great for me because it's been, you know, it's been an opportunity for me to talk about tariffs, trade. People are interested in the port again since the pandemic. No one really, you know, cared, and it opened the door for me to go speak on behalf of the port and the state of Washington on issues that we still care about, but you know, this guy in the White House doesn't. And so there was a little bit of that natural filling of the vacuum that happened, and it continues to happen. And so I think a little bit of both in terms of, you know, that autonomy we have as a port authority, as well as the gaping hole that this government is leaving in the international space.
Never waste a crisis.
No. Chaos is a ladder, as they say, right?
So my last formal question,
Yeah.
and we'll open it up to the floor. Climate change is reshaping both physical infrastructure of ports, but also trade flows through them. So we hear things like potential new opportunities of the North Sea route, right?
Yes.
But there's also, you know, disruptions, water shortages around the
Yeah.
Panama Canal, things
Yeah,
like that.
absolutely.
So how is the Port of Seattle thinking about this kind of issue?
No, it's a great question. How much time do I have? This is probably a dissertation-worthy question, but for us, I think the most, you know, in the past 10 years, the biggest shift has been the widening of the Panama Canal, which has allowed for these Triple-E class vessels, the vessels that hold like 20,000 container TEUs, to go through the Panama Canal. Was probably the big infrastructure change that, you know, fundamentally shifted. You know, for the most part, European trade happens on the East Coast and Asia trade happens on the West Coast. There's very rarely where those two cross paths. It's almost like we have a monopoly on the West Coast in Asia, and they have a monopoly on the. You know, but that's actually starting to change a little bit with the Panama Canal widening. That's part of the reason why Port of Houston is growing as well, because they're right there. But the X factor in that is droughts. For the last couple of years, the Panama Canal didn't have enough water for their canal. And so that has stymied kind of that advantage that the East Coast would have maybe had when it comes to taking trade volumes from Asia. You mentioned the North Passage. What he's referring to is that as the polar ice caps melt, there will be new trade lanes and sea routes that will form. And that's a huge concern, not just from a trade perspective, but also from a security perspective. And this is part of the reason why, rightly so, this administration is so focused on shipbuilding, because the U.S. Coast Guard actually needs these security cutters and polarized cutters that we have lost the ability to produce. They were supposed to deliver like 2 or 3 to Seattle like next year, and now it's delayed indefinitely. And so all this to say that it will remain to be seen how that trade route in specific might completely shake up. That east-west divide that I just mentioned may no longer be relevant, and you might see just ships going north and really traversing the world that way. And so both the droughts and the polar ice caps melting, and then also you have all these, you know, the war with Iran and the Strait of Hormuz. Before that, it was the Red Sea and what's happening in Lebanon with the Houthi rebels attacking vessels going through there. And so a lot of that geopolitical tension is affecting our trade flows. Some of it works in our favor. Some of it works against us as well. When you have a trade route that makes you go around the Cape Horn of Africa as opposed to going through the Red Sea, you're essentially you have to add more ships to that loop in order to keep the same volume in that schedule, which takes away vessels in the fleet from a trans-Pacific route or a transatlantic route, which will make our schedule less reliable, may raise the cost because you don't have as many vessels going back and forth, or you don't have the volume. And so what happens in the Middle East, while you may think is happening over there, it doesn't affect us. Like, we see the trade effects of that on a local level, because we're like, wait, that vessel used to come to Seattle, now it's going around Africa because they had to plug in another vessel to make that turn time. And so we're watching everything that happens in the world. It's not, nothing is isolated anymore in any way.
Globalization.
Yeah.
Yeah, everything is interconnected. All right, let's open it up for questions. We can take questions online. I see one here right on the floor. Dan, go ahead. Speak.
Go easy on me,
the
man.
speaker.
Dan and I went to AU together. We're both class of 13, so.
So honored to have the first question. By the way, Mr. Cho does really good commentary online on current administration trade policy. So you already told us, where you fall politically given your work for the Obama administration. However, you mentioned shipbuilding. If you could pick one other issue related to trade that you most agree with the current administration on, what would that be? Easy question?
Oh, on trade.
Specifically trade.
There's something called the harbor, this is going to get really wonky. There's something called the harbor maintenance tax that we have in the United States. It's a tax that we put on vessels that the federal government collects, and then they redistribute to ports in order to do dredging. So not a lot of ports have deep, water, yeah. And so what the federal government does is they tax everybody, they collect that money, and they distribute it amongst the ports that need that money for dredging. Seattle is naturally blessed with a very, very deep port. We're naturally a 51-foot deep draft. So we don't need any of that dredging money, but we sure pay into it, right? And what that does is, going back to your whole point about cost and time, it drives up the cost of doing business with the Port of Seattle. And the reason that matters is because if you're going to pay $150 more to send a container through Seattle, and you don't have to pay that $150 at Vancouver, Canada, and the rail lines go to pretty much the same place, you're going to make that choice to go up to Canada. And so if you look at the market share of Seattle and Tacoma over the last 20 years, we've lost most of our market share to Canada because of this price delta. And so we've been actually talking to the National Security Council about closing the harbor maintenance tax loophole, because a lot of folks send things to Canada to avoid the harbor maintenance tax. And so the administration is actually very in favor of a land border tax. So if you bypass a US port and you export something to Canada and you rail it into the United States, you still have to pay a tax at the border, right? It's not a percentage, but it's a flat fee. And that what that helps is with the equilibrium with US ports, right? And so I know that's a super wonky, almost protectionist policy, but it really kills us. You think about it, if you pay $150 per container, and you are exporting 1 million containers a year, which is pretty common for large big box retailers, that's $150 million you're paying, right? I mean, who wants to pay that? And so it's a huge disadvantage for us. And so some of those policies have not been bad. I'll be honest. There are certain policies. This trade war with China really bad for us, right? But other things, I think there's rhyme and reason to it. Thanks, Dan.
Yes. Please. Introduce yourself.
Sure.
My name is Peter Goldberg. Thanks for taking the time to come down here and share your expertise and insights with us. So it seems like almost every discussion across the board, not just academically, but governmentally, can't avoid the issue of AI.
Yeah.
So my question has to do with, what are your concerns on the negative side, or potentially negative side, for the realm of work that you're involved at the port there? What's coming up for you guys, and what seems to be the issues that really need to be of concern?
Thank you for that question. It's very timely. So I think the obvious answer is, and if you talk to some of my labor union constituents, it's the displacement of labor. I think that we are far away from that. If you look at where the displacement is happening, it's ironically in the tech sector, right, where it's like the entry level engineers and whatnot, right. The blue collar workers are actually in higher demand today than they were 20 years ago because we need the plumbers and the electricians and the pipe fitters and the longshoremen. I think what the longshoremen would say is that automation of ports is a big concern. And what I mean by that is, today you have longshoremen walking, climbing up 80 foot in the air to these container cranes to move the containers from ship to shore. And there are ports in Asia and Europe that have automated that. And the term automation is a little misleading because what it implies is that there's just no human. But what it really is in practice is remote controlled. Right, so we are not at a point where like an AI algorithm can like pick up a container and move it, because there's a tremendous amount of precision that requires. But you do see kind of a room like this that looks like a Wall Street trading floor with like 6 screens and a joystick, and you have the longshoremen sitting in an air-conditioned room, moving a joystick in an air-conditioned room. They're not going up 80 feet to move the containers anymore. In my mind, that is actually an augmentation of the work, not a straight-up displacement of the workers. And in my mind, that's a safer way to do the job. And so I do think that there are areas in labor where AI automation will make the job safer, more efficient, and better without necessarily displacing people. Not to say that people won't get displaced at all. There's one automated port terminal in the United States. Someone could probably write a dissertation about how they got that approved through labor unions, but it's at Long Beach. So in the LBCT, Long Beach Container Terminal, is a automated terminal. And it's the only one approved by labor in the United States. And the way they got the labor unions to sign on to that automation is they gave all of the maintenance work to the longshoremen. So the longshoremen who were formerly driving the cranes are now working on maintaining the cranes, which is pretty natural, you would think. One of my concerns, however, is that actually evolves into a labor dispute, because who used to work on the cranes? The machinists. So now you have labor unions fighting each other for work, because you have longshoremen who are adapting to the times of automation and AI to do maintenance, but then the machinist is like, wait, no, that's what we're supposed to be doing. And so as we see this convergence of labor, we're going to see more and more this type of situation. At the airport, we leverage AI from a business intelligence and strategy standpoint. When you run a port or an airport, the airport especially, one of the tough things about an airport is that the airport's never closed. We don't have a 9 to 5, right? And so when we are doing construction or we're trying to plan something, it's very difficult for us to actually experiment with the floor space or anything like that. One thing that we're building right now is something called a digital twin. So you basically create, it's like SimCity, it's kind of a weird way to put it, but you're basically replicating the port environment in a digital space. So you can run simulations on how the airport would differ or change if you were to move this gate here or reconfigure the flow of foot traffic here. And that really helps us to try and simulate if we would optimize our airport or our seaport using that digital environment. And so that's become very popular in the logistics space, because as you know, in the supply chain in logistics space is very sticky. It's very difficult, and that's part of the reason why during the pandemic we had such a hard time adapting to the pandemics, because it's very sticky. And so being able to replicate that environment in a digital atmosphere for you to then run simulations on how things could be different, or you can optimize a container yard based on your container configuration without having to actually physically move all the containers to see if it works better. And so that's some of the stuff that's happening. But I think a lot of the optimization piece of on the global level will help a lot. There are a lot of people who still ship to LA, Long Beach, just because that's what they're used to, right? That they know the port, despite the fact that they can get their containers through Seattle like in half the time, right? So if you have an AI algorithm that says, this doesn't make any sense, you should send it to Seattle, that would bode well for us, I think.
So one question, if I could follow up on this. Most U.S. ports are not 24/7, right?
None of them are. Yeah.
Whereas many Asian ports are.
Yeah.
And Rotterdam, right? Many European.
Rotterdam, Singapore, Korea. You make a really good point here because I think unless ports run 24/7, automation is not economically feasible. If you look at, so in the port industry, we're getting wonky over here, one of the key performance indicators of a port is lifts per hour. How many times can you take a container off a vessel onto the shore in an hour? So on industry average, it's maybe like 32-ish, right? So if you do 32 lifts an hour, which is about one container every 2 minutes, that's a fairly decent port by American standards. You go to Asia and you ask them what's your lift per hour at an automated port, they're actually probably around 28, 27, right? So they're not more efficient than humans, right? But they run 24/7. And that's the competitive advantage of having automated terminal. And from a cost to benefit standpoint, it costs billions of dollars to build an automated terminal, but it pays a dividend because you can run the terminal 24/7. In the US, our labor contracts do not allow for 20. In fact, they don't even work weekends. It's Monday through Friday, right? 5-day gates, that's it. And so as long as that standard is in place, it's not like investing in an automated terminal doesn't really make sense. I mentioned LBCT. LBCT still hasn't paid off, even though it's an automated terminal. They still have to work the normal hours, the 2 shifts. And so the only point at which an automation pays off is if you can run it all the time. And so there's a limit to it. I don't know. That's why I don't think automation at ports will happen anytime soon here in the U.S.
Yeah. Well, it gets at sort of the complicated social and institutional interactions between not only governments, but also the labor force, and the local community may not want trucks running through 24 hours a day. Right?
I don't know if you've read the book, The Container.
No, I've not.
It's a fascinating book. You should read it. It's called The Container. It's literally the history of the shipping container, right? And it's a fascinating history because you don't realize shipping container has been only around maybe for 50 years, right? It was only recent that the globe adopted a standard on how to ship things, which is amazing in itself. But in the book, it tells you how the longshoremen were against containerization. I talk about this all the time. The labor movement was anti-container. And the reason is because when containers didn't exist, it was a super laborious thing to do to ship something. You put it on a pallet, you'd have to, they used to use those spikes and put it, and then it was very inefficient. Their fear was that if you containerize things, it would make things too efficient and it would kill longshore jobs. That was their theory, is that if you put everything into a box and you ship it, you're going to need less of us because you don't need us, But what happened was trade exploded.
Right.
There was such a massive explosion of international trade that there are more longshoremen today than there were 50 years ago. That's the part they didn't see. And so oftentimes I think about AI and automation through that lens. Like, what kind of expansion are we going to see as a result of AI and automation that we are not foreseeing that might create, maybe not the same jobs, right? Because the longshoremen don't use those picks anymore. But what skill set or anything like that will we need to, kind of accommodate or prepare for whatever happens when the AI and automation takes over?
So it's an interesting economic phenomena, by the way, that when you get more efficiency, you tend to get more volume. And often the increase in volume creates more jobs than the decreased job intensity from the productivity gains. How many people here use ATMs? Right? Yeah, I haven't used one for a while, but when ATMs were introduced, they thought that was going to kill the bank tellers, and instead, number of bank teller jobs increased significantly. Now, bank teller jobs have decreased significantly because of online banking, right? So, there was a volume effect when people put ATMs in that allowed bank tellers to do different kinds of work. So that's an interesting thing. And this is a big issue around ports.
Absolutely.
No, don't take offense here, but there is no U.S. port ranked in the top 60 in terms of efficiency.
That's right.
In terms of volume, yeah, we're way up there. okay? But in terms of efficiency, no.
Yeah, I feel like Barry Eichengreen would say this is part of our exorbitant privilege as America. It's when you sell to America and you have an inefficient port, what are you going to do about it? You're not, I mean, honestly, I mean, it's one of the, it's hubris, really. It's like, you're not going to be able to, you know, what are you going to do?
Barry, by the way, is a professor of economics at UCal Berkeley. Yes, another question here.
Hi there, Commissioner Cho. So I'm actually, I told you earlier, I'm an alumni of the Port of
Yes.
Seattle Diversity and Contracting Department and alumni of AU. So I had a question more so for the students or the
Yeah.
recent alumni of, you know, how can students utilize their international development focused studies and transfer that towards organizations like the Port when most positions are either in construction on the aviation side or marine operations?
Yeah. No, I appreciate that question, and obviously you're very familiar with the port, and you've done work for us. But I think, like I said earlier, all politics is local. But one of the things that the port, in particular, prides itself in is our community engagement and the work we do to help the community, right? And so, the ports sit at this interesting cross section of economic development. But as you and I were talking about earlier, sometimes economic development doesn't always equate to better quality of life, right? So I'll give you an example. The airport, Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, does about 53.5 million passengers a year. That was a record for us last year. Seattle-Tacoma International Airport was built at a capacity of 30 million. Okay, so we're far beyond our capacity. But as a result of that, the SeaTac area and the surrounding cities benefit from that economic multiplier effect of having the airport. However, if you do studies around the environment, you'll see that there are higher asthma rates, higher eczema rates around the airport. So this is what I mean when you say economic development or that growth doesn't always equate to a better quality of life. And so what we've done as a port is we have an entire community engagement external relations teams that does that social impact, that engagement. So we go out and we plant trees. We passed a policy at the port, a 4-to-1 ratio. If we pluck one tree out, we are by policy required to plant 4 in, right? And you know, tree canopy helps a lot with airplane noise and air. Right, when you have tree canopy, it mitigates the noise. Okay? The trees absorb the noise, and it also helps with air quality, right? Insulation, right? We have a program that allows for residents within a certain radius of the airport to apply for sound mitigation, so they can replace the windows of their houses so that that sound is mitigated. We do cleanups, you know, whether it's along the Duwamish Waterway or around the airport. We do these cleanups. And so, you know, I think there's definitely a nexus between development or international development and that work you might do on an international level that applies directly to the local level, right? So a lot of the stuff that you might have done in, you know, Rwanda or you know, or other places around the world in the developing country might be directly applicable to what we're doing in Seattle. As far as cleanups are concerned or infrastructure that benefits the community. So I think there's definitely a direct connection there.
I think that's great. Recognizing that we all live locally, and yet most of us pay attention to what's happening in capital, right? So trying to pay attention to what's going on more locally and trying to solve those problems locally is not a bad idea. Another question, please.
Good afternoon, and props to you for navigating the complexity of the world and going.
I'm trying.
No, I mean,
I don't have figured it out yet, but
students of multiple generations need to hear it, and you're so
Thank you.
chill and zen, and you know that's the world, and that makes it interesting, and that's why we go to schools like this.
Appreciate
My
it.
name is Mika Hoodboy. I didn't go to the school. I went to Fletcher, and I used to work at USAID. My
Okay.
question is about kind of the big picture.
Yeah.
What kind of unit do you have, like an intelligence, small I, or risk analysis
Yeah.
unit that helps you keep a pulse on
Yeah.
where Seattle sits
Yeah.
as things shift? How do you think about it? What kind of
Yeah.
info do you rely on?
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of consultants that help us with this, right? We get a report biannually, maybe, that tells us where we are competitively relative to other ports, how our market share is doing relative to other ports, what the global trade trends are, and whatnot. So there are a lot of consulting firms who aggregate this data and really provide us with a sobering picture of where the port is relative to the other ports. The other thing is, and this is where your personal network is so important, because the people you know around the world in this industry can tell you exactly what's happening on the ground, right? Why this string is no longer calling Seattle and they're going to Vancouver instead, or why we lost something to Oakland or Portland, right? And so, having that, being able to pick up the phone and call somebody to get the details from the horse's mouth is super important. And so it's a combination of having that macro data and that research done for us, and then part of it is just having a wide enough network to be able to pick up the phone or go to a conference and say, hey, what's going on here? Or like, where do you see the growth? Or what are the market opportunities in Vietnam, or something like that? And so that's where, again, that skill around business development and networking really pays off, because you end up with a very strong network of folks that you can call upon. And it goes both ways too. When people call me and ask me about what's happening in Seattle or what the situation is here, I'm always happy to be a resource to them, so that someday I can call upon them to do the same thing. And so it's not transactional necessarily, but at the end of the day, I think the industry itself wants everyone to succeed. We all understand that the pie is big enough for all of us to eat, so to speak. And so, I don't cheer against LA or Long Beach, or I don't wish ill upon Vancouver. I just want their containers to come to my gateway.
Hello.
Hey.
My name's Josie Tile. I'm the assistant dean here at SIS. And I wanted to ask you if you could talk to us about how, it's kind of a twofer.
Sure.
How your experience in government has changed from when you were more junior to where you were supporting principals, right, as a staffer,
Yeah.
to now where you're out front having to make decisions about what it is that you should be doing to define success for your area. So that's one.
Yeah.
But the other is also if you have any more refined views of government, now that you've been in the game for a long time,
Yeah.
what government should be.
Yeah. Thank you for those questions. Those are good questions. I feel like, I don't know if my views have shifted, but I see the same thing from different points, because I used to work for a politician, now I'm a politician, right? And sometimes it's all about the optics. And there are colleagues of mine in various forms of government and other, they know it's the wrong policy, but they make that choice because they know that's the policy choice that's going to get the claps or the votes. And it's really unfortunate. I really try not to be that guy. But there are moments where, like we were talking about crews earlier, right? And we talk about crews is a very sensitive topic in local politics, because crews is not great for the environment, right? But from an economic standpoint, crews is a cash cow, right? It brings in so many jobs, it makes so much jobs, it brings in millions of dollars of revenue for local businesses, because these tourists come in, it's great. Is it bad for the environment? Absolutely. Would it be political suicide to build another cruise terminal in Seattle? Absolutely. Is it the right choice to build that cruise terminal? It could be. But is it a foregone conclusion because it's politically sensitive, despite it being the right choice? Probably, right? And my position on the cruise has always been very consistent. I said, look, the choice is not cruise or no cruise. The choice is cruise in Seattle or cruise somewhere else, right? And you can argue that we should kick cruise out of Seattle. We could do that tomorrow. But that just means they're going to go down to Portland or another port where they're going to allow them to do all the dumping and all the things that we hate. So my philosophy on this is, hey, let's bring them here and let's make them comply with the highest environmental standards in the country. So we set the example so that when they go to Miami or LA or Long Beach, they're already doing something that's more stringent elsewhere. Like, what do we get by kicking the can down to Portland, where they're desperate for the business and they'll let them do whatever they want? Last I checked, we all breathe the same air and all the oceans are connected, right? And so I've tried to be rational, but there, I feel like today, in today's political environment, that, this 2-minute explanation would not fly because I only have 30 seconds on an Instagram reel to explain it, right? And so that's the challenge, right? It's like and quite frankly, I would much rather rake in $40 million a year from a cruise berth and invest it into environmental programs, right? Than that cruise ship go somewhere else and pollute all they want, right? Like, those are the calculations I have to make, right? And so for me, it's, for some of my colleagues, it's not that complicated. For them, it's, people don't like cruise, we're not gonna build a cruise terminal. For me, it's like, yeah, but I get that. The optics, that makes total sense. From a practical policymaker standpoint, we have to be able to explain the net benefits of this, right? It generates $180 million, and we can do really good stuff with that, right? And so I feel like that discussion is lost in today's politics, that we just do not have the bandwidth or the attention span to really listen to things to a certain extent. I think most people understand things a mile wide and an inch deep, right? And that's a huge problem right now because people don't understand what's going on. So, and then your second question was around, sorry, I went on a tangent.
No, it was good. I think you sort of addressed both, which was how have your views of government and what it should be?
I think it's extremely valuable to actually have private sector experience. And I didn't feel that way earlier in my career, but I've definitely felt that today. I have a lot of colleagues in Seattle who are very progressive. I'm progressive myself, but don't understand business, right? And there's a very clear movement out of Seattle into Bellevue, like for those of you who are from our area. And it's part of the reason is because we have a lot of politicians locally who don't understand how businesses work, and they're basically making it almost impossible to do business. I think also from my experience on the Hill, I was a 23-year-old working for a member of Congress, advising him on how to vote. I had lobbyists coming to me telling me how my boss should vote. Like, what do I know, right? And I think those who have that on-the-ground experience, like in the businesses, are the best to come back and then regulate them, right? And I think that we demonize the revolving door a lot because we see it in a negative light, but like if you had some Wall Street guys, looking at synthetic CDOs or, before the financial crisis, or who understood these, leverage buyout mechanisms and all this stuff that happened on Wall Street before the 2008 financial crisis, we may have been able to get ahead of that. And the fact that we had no idea what some of these mechanisms, what these products were doing, or how they were made up, or what a mortgage-backed security was, resulted in this huge financial crisis. I do think that if you have some experience on the private sector side, you see it, you come back and you say, hey, this is really dangerous. We should try and figure out how to, and I think AI is a good example of that. We have a lot of AI practitioners that should be coming into the government and say, hey, this is how we should safely regulate this to make sure it doesn't get out of hand, right? I think AI is probably that next frontier in terms of that revolving door, really trying to make sure that we don't go off the reservation and something really bad happens.
As long as those people coming in have the broader social objective of...
Yes. Well, they're not coming in for the money, that's for sure. So,
at least not while they're there. Well, I think we've reached the end of our panel here. So I really thank you, Sam. You've given us a great insights on what it's like to lead international trade at a local level, all the complexities in terms of economic development, environmental externalities, the politics of trying to get things done. So I think we really appreciate you. We really appreciate that you've come back to AU, SIS, and shared with faculty and students and those online. I'm sorry, I really haven't acknowledged them as much as I should. Your expertise and how you can navigate this complex world and still make a difference at the local level.
Thank you so much. This was fun.